What if everything you thought you knew about medieval exploration is wrong? Forget sun-splashed caravels plowing warm waters. Tonight, we're steering north, into a world of knife-edged wind and seas that close like jaws. We're chasing the untold stories of explorers who read the sky through cloud and ice, who stitched oceans together with memory, and whose achievements were buried under snow, and then under history. Picture a hull built broad and patient, a gnar, riding the swell like a seal. The deck glistens with a glaze of brine. The rigging sings. The air burns your lungs. Fog hangs low as wool. Ahead, ice groans, alive, shifting, plodding. The helmsman's mittened hand is steady. He squints at the pale smear of sun behind the cloud and at a shadow of darker water threading through the pack. No compass, no charts worth the name. Only a mind trained to hold wind and wave like numbers on an abacus, and a crew that trusts him with their blood. These were not just hardy Vikings muscling west into legend. They were navigators and pragmatists, farmers and traders, women as well as men, indigenous experts as well as Norse sailors. They read birds, whales, and driftwood like messages. They followed invisible highways, leads through broken ice called Polinius. They piloted by the sound of water under keel and the color of light on the underside of clouds. And their impact was profound, then quietly erased, folded into saga, rumor, and footnotes. Why go into the Arctic at all? Not for fantasies of fame. The medieval North offered harder realities. Exile and second chances wood where none grew, iron where none could be forged, walrus ivory carved into bishops and queens for faraway chessboards, furs that paid debts, and the possibility, always the possibility, of a shore no one your grandmother knew had ever named. Add a climate window, the medieval warm period, that softened sea ice and lengthened summers by a breath, and the horizon began to call in a voice as old as hunger. Start with a name that's more marketing than myth. Erik the Red. Exiled from Iceland around 982 for killings and a temper that matched his hair, he sailed west on rumor. Another sailor, Gunnbjorn, had once been driven off course and sighted skerries, rocky islets, where no one expected them. Erik found more than rocks. He threaded along a blunt coast, then a long fjord, and then green pastures tucked like secrets behind sheltering hills. When he returned to Iceland, he called the place Greenland, because he knew a name could pull people across oceans. In 985 he led families there. Women, children, sheep, cattle, carved beams, good luck. They raised stone and turf houses at Brattle and beyond. They built a church so small you can stand in it today and touch both walls with outstretched arms. 2 settlements clung to the mild southwest of an immense island, farming under a sun that stayed longer than it ought to and paddling out after seals and trout when it didn't. Erik's story you've heard in outlines. But look closer and the edges sharpen. Those settlers weren't accident-prone berserkers. They were planners with sailing calendars and wool quotas. Their ships, narrower, were fat-bellied freighters, not raiding longships, designed for cargo and safety, not speed. They used sailing directions passed by mouth. When to leave, where to aim so the current brings you up from leeward, how to read the milk-green light that means there's glacial silt in the water, and therefore land within a day. They named hazards with precision. Hafvilla, the mind confusion of fog. Ilviri, the ugly weather that kills. Israk, the rafts of broken ice that whisper danger at night when eyes can't see. If Erik's Greenland was foundation, what came next was audacity. Bjarni Herjolfsson, looking for his father in Greenland, missed it in fog and saw, instead, a roll call of coasts. One wooded, one flat and stone-strewn, one gently rising with fine land beyond. He didn't land, but he told the tale, and another man, Erik's son Leif, listened. Around the year 1000, Leif bought Bjarni's ship and sailed to find those coasts. The first European to set foot in a place the sagas would call Vinland. They found beaches with wild grapes, or perhaps berries so heavy they stained hands. They found timber rich enough to make men from treeless places weep for joy. They found butternuts, the kind that do not grow in the far north, carried back to a Greenland hall and later dug from the soil by archaeologists at Lanseaux Meadows in Newfoundland. For a season, maybe two, they built halls, repaired ships, learned the silence of a foreign forest at night. In those camps, the most astonishing figure might be a woman. Gur Orbjarnarter, Gudrid, daughter of Iceland, traveler of oceans. She crossed the North Atlantic several times, wintered in the New World, and bore a child, Snorri, on that far shore. She sailed home, then to Rome on pilgrimage, then home again, her life a braid of endurance and curiosity. For centuries, she lived only in sagas, her voice filtered through skald and scribe. Then archaeologists found the remains of a longhouse at Glomber, in Iceland, right where her story said she'd ended her days. Legend reached out a hand and evidence took it. If these crossings were possible, how were they done? Not by dead reckoning alone. The Norse hand kept a sky in the head. At high noon, latitude lives in the angle of the sun. A shadow cast by a gnomon on a simple board can hint at it. The arc of the midnight sun north of the Arctic Circle can serve as a clock if you know how to watch. A line of cloud underlit by rose suggests open water beyond ice. A string of birds draws a line from sea to shore when fog makes the sea a room without walls. Some stories speak of a sunstone, a crystal like Iceland's spar, used to find the hidden sun in overcast, the way polarized light tells on itself. Whether every crew carried such a stone is uncertain. What is certain is that these people learned to pull direction out of things most of us no longer see. And the North was not empty when the Norse arrived. They met people the sagas call Skraelings, Dorset and later Thule ancestors of the Inuit, masters of a landscape Europeans never fully understood. Imagine skin boats, light and swift, noses knifing into whitecaps, toggling harpoons that lock in flesh then pivot to hold, parkas cut to breathe and insulate at once, sleds that sing across ice, stone lamps that make a home of a snow house. The Thule moved east across the Arctic in the centuries after 1000, hopping between Polynius, open water that winter keeps like windows in its glass. They traded with Norse Greenlanders. Iron for hides, timber for down, words for words. They taught what every Arctic traveler must learn. That the path through is not the shortest one, and that survival is a pact, between person and land, between attention and humility. If the Norse went west, others went north along a different shore. On the White Sea and the Barents, Pomer seafarers from Russlands learned to build koches, ice-worthy boats with rounded hulls that the pack could squeeze up and out instead of cracking. They threaded gulfs with names like knives and winters like sentences. They found passes, Ugorsky Shar, Kara Gate, where the ocean breathes between continents. They hunted and traded, mapped with memory, and reached islands of driftwood and fog. Somewhere in those latitudes lie the bones of forgotten harbors, the smoke of forgotten hearths, the ghosts of routes only song remembers. Their work rarely makes glossy atlases. It should. Why, if so much happened, is the Arctic story often shrunk to a prologue to Columbus? Partly because the Norse story runs on different fuel. They weren't annexing empires. They were extending farms and parish maps, tying cattle and soul to new grass, bringing priests to bless snow as holy as loam. Their biggest export from Greenland was walrus ivory, not gold. Their power was local, not imperial. Partly because their archives were oral, then handwritten on calfskin where mold and accident could win. Partly because later ages preferred a narrative with flags and cannons to one with knitting needles and seal oil lamps. And partly because the far north is a cruel librarian. Keeps secrets. It buries wood. It erases footprints. That erasure is not complete. In turf walls and dung layers, in pollen trapped in peat, in a butternut shell where no butternut tree grows, in a spindle whorl and a crucible bead found far from any smithy, the medieval North mutters with clarity if you lean close enough. Lance Aux Meadows tells us someone came, built, left. Further south, the sagas hint, but the earth is coy. At Cassiersuck, Brattle, graves watch the fjord. At Herjolfsson's, stitched cloth survived in graves sealed by cold. A fashion catalogue from the end of a colony. One dress. Greenlandic, late medieval. Cut to keep heat and look fine at the same time. A heart stops in a place that hard, and the tailor's line outlives the heartbeat. Listen for the moral written under the ice. Exploration here did not always mean permanent colonies and drawn borders. It meant experiments. Winter and watch, test and tally, survive or sail away. It meant that contact could be barter at a beach, not conquest in a square. It meant that failure was not a tragedy but a teacher. The Vinland camps did not endure, but the learning did. Sailing seasons, winds, the shape of the coast, the truth that there is land there and that it rises gently and that the rivers fish heavily. Information found a way home even when households did not. If you're hearing this and thinking, how much have we missed because we were looking for the wrong kind of flag? Good. That is the point. The medieval Arctic was full of names you may never have heard. Not just Leif, but Karlsefni, the trader who tried to plant a longer colony. Not just Erik, but his wife Gudrid, who asked for a church and got one, then withdrew to live more simply. Not just men at oars, but women at hearths and on decks, steering lives as surely as any helmsman steers a ship. And far from Scandinavia, monks drew maps that grew a world like a rose on vellum, and one of them, Aladrisi in Sicily, listened to travelers and sketched islands in the North Atlantic where textbooks insisted only dragon tales lived. Some echoes are distorted, but they are echoes all the same. What did these navigators carry that we have lost? Calibrated attention, the ability to store a coastline in the body, the way the swell changes 50 miles from land, the taste of air when you're entering a river, the way cloud lies flat if there are mountains underneath it. A willingness to take counsel from those who lived there before, from Sami reindeer herders who knew passes and snowfall like scripture, from Inuit who could read windscour on snow the way a scholar reads a page. They blended technologies. Norse iron for Inuit design, russet wool for sealskin, faith for pragmatism, song for direction. The Arctic rewards humility and kills arrogance quickly. The ones we remember are the ones who learned that lesson before the ice taught it sharper. What do we, living far from pack ice and fjords, do with their story? First, Strip away the romance that makes them invincible. They were not. Ships splintered. Men drowned in the sudden quiet that comes when a wave closes over your head and the world becomes a thick, green room. Women buried children. Whole farmsteads moved when hay couldn't be cut. Greenland's western settlement emptied around the mid-140th century. The eastern settlement hung on until the 1400s. Then the graves fell quiet. Trade routes shifted. Ivory lost its value. Climate tightened its fist. Survival, for them as for us, was not guaranteed by courage alone, but by the fit between community and place. Second, let the North correct a habit in our history, the habit of writing with one alphabet. The Norse told their tale in sagas that blend report and flourish. Inuit tell in story and sculpture and the memory of routes. Russians remember in toponyms and work songs. If you ask the same question 3 ways, what happened, what did it mean, what did it feel like, you get 3 different truths. Together, they look like the weather, variable up close, patterned from a distance, beautiful and dangerous to misread. Third, take a breath and feel the cold that those people felt. Wind drives tears from your eyes. The sail snaps. The helmsman's hair freezes into a white crown. In the fog, the color of the world drains to black, white, and the gray between. On shore, boots crunch on frost-hardened ground. Smoke rises from a hole in a turf roof. Someone rubs a thumb over a bead polished by 2 centuries of hands before hers. The Arctic is not a map. It is a set of textures and demands. Those who walked it learned to answer, and their answers, timbering a hull a little fuller, tying a knot a little looser so it can be worked with mittens, setting a sail lower because the wind gusts like a knife here, are the grammar of survival. You're watching Ash and Crown history. If you believe forgotten stories deserve center stage, if you want history that makes you feel the wind and taste the brine, subscribe now. It helps more than you think, and it keeps us sailing into places most shows won't risk. Before we leave this first stretch of water, take one last look at the horizon. Somewhere beyond it lies a campsite with a hearth still faintly warm in the ground, and a shard of worked iron in a place iron shouldn't be. Somewhere there's a monk's note about islands where the day lingers like a guest who won't go home. Somewhere there's a woman whose life rewrote what we thought a medieval life could be. In our next chapter, we follow Leif's wake more closely. We walk Vinland's shore with Gudrid and Karlsefni, and we listen for the first difficult conversations between people who'd never seen each other's faces before. And we ask a harder question: what counts as discovery and who gets to decide? You come ashore where the forest leans down to kiss a beach of pale stones. The air smells like spruce and salt and berries crushed underfoot. Somewhere inland a thrush drops a note like water in a bowl. Men and women unload a hull, planks, barrels, sacks, the familiar into the unknown. A ring of turf grows into a low wall. Stakes become a hall. The first smoke climbs and writes a thin line on the sky. For a heartbeat the world looks simple. Food, shelter, fire, watch. Then you notice the quiet attention in every face. They are listening for a language they don't yet speak. The creak of trees in unfamiliar wind. The way the tide breathes on this shore. The sounds that mean bear. The sounds that mean other people. Leif's crew picked a wintering place near salmon rivers and a tide that did not pull the ships apart. They cut timber as if drunk on abundance. In Greenland, a single beam is a gift from the sea. Here the woods stand thick as a promise. They found berries heavy enough to stain palms and mouths, called the place Vinland in sagas that loved the taste of a good name, and settled into a rhythm that any farm knows. Mend, gather, count. Even in that work, the ocean insisted on being consulted. The swell told them when to haul the boat up. The birds told them when the seasons turned. Fog told them humility. The story that matters next is not only a man's. Gur Orbjarnarder moved across water like other people move across fields. First to Greenland, then to this new shore. When she felt the first contraction, someone warmed water and another hand gripped hers. Her son, Snorri, blinked at a ceiling of New World timber, and his first breath mixed Atlantic damp with smoke and the smell of boiled moss. Later he would be a farmer and a lawman in Iceland, and his name would be proof that a woman once labored here and that the North's family tree reached farther than we knew. It is a thing to remember. The first footprints on a beach are news. The first birth makes it a place. Thorfinn Karlsefni came with her. Merchant, shipowner, stubborn enough to attempt what others only tasted. He brought 3 ships, perhaps 140 souls, cattle even, and tried to do what human beings do everywhere. Turn a camp into a town. They built a perimeter. They watched the tree line. They learned the tides. The sagas say the first people to approach came in skin boats, quiet as seals until the last moment. The words between them were gestures at first. Trade hands miming want and offer, eyebrows doing their best diplomacy. Red cloth for pelts, milk for... No, milk made them ill. Their bodies knew other animals. The Norse bartered iron for hides and down. For a season, the beach became a market and laughter sounded the same in 2 languages. Then someone made a mistake. A bull broke loose, perhaps. A man misunderstood a gesture and fear turned out to be bilingual too. A fight is always easier to start than a language. Stones and arrows shouting, the shuffle of retreat, the quick, hot silence after a body falls. The camp gathered itself small and tight, eyes searching the trees. Freydis, Erik's daughter, the saga says, stood when others broke, slapped the flat of a blade against her breast with a cry so fierce the attackers stumbled. The story has been polished by centuries. You can hear the scald in it. But under the flair lies something common. Someone decided to be more terrifying than the terror in front of them, and the line held long enough to run. Karlsefni left after that second year. The accounts say practical reasons ended the attempt as much as fear did. Distance, supply, the colony's smallness against a continent's scale. He sailed home with timber and tail. At Lonseux Meadows in Newfoundland, iron slag in a hearth tells us they smelted bog or for nails and rivets. The first metallurgy in the Americas since antiquity, a small furnace breathing like an animal in the cold. A spindle whorl turned thread here. A butternut shell, the kind that grows far to the south, sat where it had no business sitting, and so we know feet went farther than that northern tip. The archaeology is sparse, stubborn, and exact. Someone came. Someone worked iron. Someone left. Who wrote it down? A scribe with a good ear and a clear hand. In Iceland, centuries later, a monk or chieftain's secretary inked calfskin with words that had lived in mouths. The saga of the Greenlanders. The saga of Erik the Red. Ari Orgilsson, called the Learned, wrote a history of the Icelanders long before, anchoring people to dates, ships to winters. Across the sea, Adam of Bremen listened to a king and wrote that there was a land out west where vines grew and wheat sowed itself. In Norman Sicily, Alidrisi asked captains and merchants what the ocean looked like from their decks, and his Arabic script wandered north and west, adding islands to the skin of a silver map. The Hereford Mappa Mundi is full of monsters, but even monsters lean in the right direction when 1,000 reports whisper under a pen. A map, any map, is a bet. The medieval bets are beautiful oddities. A dragon's tail here, a saint there, a sea that needs a guardian drawn into it to keep people honest. Meanwhile, a sea captain's chart might be nothing more than lines of wind memory and sun angles in a head, current lines felt in thighs, and a palm calloused in ways that remember rope. A monastery keeps an astrolabe, a court clerk owns an armillary sphere, a ship keeps only a gnomon, a stick that makes a shadow, and a mind that knows what a noon shadow means in June versus August. A Sami reindeer herder reads snow like an astronomer reads stars and tells a trader which pass will not bury him tomorrow. The seam between science and skill is thin as a knife here. If you want to understand the technology in these voyages, go to a beach in your mind at midnight and listen. The surf tells the depth. The drift line tells the last storm's height. The shape of the breaker reveals what the ground underwater looks like. Long, low lines mean sand. Steep shoulders and sudden thunder mean rock. The underside of a cloud glows milky where light bounces from sea ice. Birds flying inland at dusk draw lines you can follow. Whales prefer certain edges. Their breath smells different in fog and can lead you like a lamp if you know how to expect it. The sun at midnight north of the circle is an instrument if you think of it as such. It wasn't only the Atlantic. East of the North Cape, Pomer sailors from the White Sea built round-bellied koches that would ride up under pressure instead of cracking. They worked the Kara Gate and Ugorski Shar, where water fleets through stone and ice behaves like a living thing with its own moods. They wintered under auroras that hiss, traded with Nenets herders for meat and knowledge, and carved their routes into memory instead of parchment. In those latitudes, a wrong guess wasn't corrected in court. It was corrected by the sea. That is a ruthless editor, and it made them precise. The Norse in Greenland balanced a world on 3 legs. Hay cut in a brief bright summer, seal hunted on ice when the world turned to glass, and trade. A bishop's tithe in ivory, a bride's dowry in cloth, a lapidary's dreams in polar bear fur and narwhal tooth. Church bells rang in turf-built chapels. A hall held a chess set of walrus ivory bishops and kings moving in little wars across a square battlefield. The King's Mirror, a Norwegian didactic text from the mid-13th century, described Greenland's waters, the whales, the freezing of the sea, and the way men in skin boats ride surf like seabirds. He wrote as someone who had talked to sailors, not as a man who guessed. Then prices fell for ivory. The climate tightened. Ships came less often. In Herjolfsson's, tailors stitched garments so well that when graves opened centuries later, the thread told fashion historians what Greenlanders wore the year before the last ship failed to arrive. And the Inuit Thule ancestors kept their calendars without bells, reading ice and seal and star. They traded where it made sense and kept away where it did not. At Ruin Island far up Baffin Bay, houses squat like low clouds. On Ellesmere a harpoon head lies still in the handbone that held it. In a Norse midden on Greenland's west, an antler sledge runner tells a story of borrowing that no one wrote down. People swap techniques the way they swap songs. Because they work, and because they make life a fraction easier in a hard place. The North is a generous teacher if you pay attention and a merciless one if you don't. There are other rumors, tantalizing and thin. Claudius Clavis, a Dane in the 15th century, drew the north with a confidence that suggests he talked to people who had been there. A fragmentary Skalholt map, drawn centuries later, shows Vinland, Markland, Helgeland, fields, forests, flat stones. Echoes of words that tug at the sleeve. Monks told tales of Irish hermits sailing far in hideboats, and St. Brendan's voyages grew into a literature of holy wanderings. Sober people will tell you not to lean too hard on that. Sober people are right. But sometimes a myth is a fossil of a fact, shifted, mineralized, still shaped like a thing that lived. Walk back to the Vinland camp and listen to the sound of a community choosing to go home. It is not defeat. It is arithmetic. The ships need nails, the nails need iron. The iron needs ore, the ore here needs time, and time is food, and food is winter, and winter is not a metaphor in this latitude. People pack slowly. Little things go missing and then appear tied to a belt or tucked into a boot. Someone finds a child's carved toy under a bench, ruddy wood polished by a small mouth, and slips it into a chest because losing a toy hurts more than losing a plank. The last footprints on the beach look like first footprints from a distance. History loves a clean line. Life rarely gives it one. Does any of this change what we mean when we say discovery? It should. Discovery can be mutual. I see you, you see me. We both learn something we couldn't learn alone. It can be partial. We wintered there, we left. Our ash became someone else's soil. It can be tragic. We met, and between us misunderstanding grew faster than words. The word itself carries a trapdoor. Uncovered by whom? For whose benefit? A baby born in a timber hall in Vinland discovered a womb is a room and a world is bigger than the island where his grandparents lay. A biotic hunter discovered that strangers tasted milk and grew sick and loved red cloth and smiled too widely when they were afraid. The categories are porous. The consequences are not. In a scriptorium, a candle gutters and someone sets a new wick. He sharpens a quill with a small knife that shares a table with a loaf of bread and a pear. He dips the nib and draws a line that becomes a ship, that becomes a voyage, that becomes a memory bigger than a man. On a headland, a woman rubs oil into a child's hair and hums, and the note she holds draws the curve of a coastline more truly than any pen. A cartographer in a city far to the south copies an older coast, adds an island because a traveler swore to him with a hand on a relic that he had drunk water there. A reindeer crosses a pass at dawn, and a hunter learns the lesson before the day can even smile. All of this is exploration. Most of it is not flags. You will hear people say we are past the age of discovery. We are not. We are past the age where we believed discovery meant sticking a name in ground that did not ask to be named. The medieval Arctic insists on a better definition. Attention applied over time until a place reveals its grammar. By that definition, the monk with a sextant and the fisherman with a finger in the wind sit at the same table. So do we. If we can learn to sit still long enough to listen to a thing, or read long enough to hear a voice tucked under a skald's flourish. If you've made it this far with us, if the salt is on your tongue and the smoke is in your hair, then you're our kind of traveler. This is Ash and Crown History. Subscribe so you don't lose the thread. We'll keep bringing you stories that ask more questions than they answer and leave you with the good kind of restlessness. Before we turn the page, consider the people who braided this story together across 5 centuries. A Greenland woman counting hay bales with lips moving in prayer. A Labrador fisherman teaching a gesture to a stranger that means trade and not threat. A Russ boat builder shaving a plank until its curve fits ice like a mitten fits a hand. A bishop writing to Norway to ask for a new chalice because the old one cracked in the freeze. An Inuit elder telling a child which stars to trust when the ice sings danger through your boots. They never met. They still collaborated. Next we'll follow the Pomer east into water that grinds ships to powder and yet yields to a hull shaped like patience. We'll sit with a monk and his astrolabe on a tower roof while he turns the sky into numbers. We'll stand in a Greenland church and feel how fear and faith sound the same when sung in winter. And finally we'll watch the last Greenland farm light go out and ask whether it was climate, commerce, conflict, or simply time that blew it dark. You climb a tower stair worn smooth by centuries of feet and step into a room full of sky. A monk stands by an open arch with an astrolabe hanging from a nail. Brass warms in his palm. Numbers and stars dance on plates. He sights the sun at noon, notes the shadow's angle, and scratches figures into a wax tablet. He is not going to see, but he is quietly changing how far a sailor can trust his eyes. The calculations drifting from Arabic into Latin, the tables of Al-Batani, the geometry that Al-Khwarizmi named, the measurements of Al-Biruni, slide through scriptoria like snowmelt, pooling in minds hungry for certainty. A few generations from now, a helmsman inland of the Arctic Circle will know his latitude more precisely because a scholar far away taught him a better way to read the sky. At sea, the tools are simpler. A stick and a shadow. A small board floating in a pail. No magic, just a horizon when fog swallows the real one. The Norse shadow board, reconstructed from fragments found in a Greenland ruin on Unartic, may have let a steersman hold a latitude by watching a noon shadow's length shift across a carved circle. Scholars argue about its use. But the principle is plain. You can sail east-west if you have something to tell you you're still where you meant to be. As for the sunstone, Iceland's spar that splits light and can reveal the sun's hidden position on a cloudy day. Some experiments say perhaps, some scholars say no. Either way, the idea tells us what these sailors craved. A way to wring direction from a sky that lies. In the century before Erik the Red, a man named Othere of Hålogaland stood in King Alfred's hall and told him about sailing north until the land turned east and then south again, around the world's top. He spoke of Jarmeland on the White Sea and a river where traders stacked furs like coin. Alfred's scribe stitched Othere's words into a translation of Orosius, and suddenly the cold edge of Europe had a paragraph where before there was only blank. Later, Norse ships probed those same waters. Russ merchants and Pomer seafarers turned them into routes, building koches with round bellies that the ice could lift instead of crush. They named passes where the ocean threads the stone, Ugorsky Shar, Karagate, and taught their sons to listen to ice. Language filled with new verbs. To heave up a hull, to feel for a lead, to hear a flow moving while the world looks still. The Arctic tests equipment until only the good ideas live. A Norse nar is a compromise you can see. Broad beam, low draft, a hull that keeps its nerve when a sea hits wrong, a sail low and wide for a sky that throws gusts like stones. Inuit skin boats are the same thesis, different solution. Weight reduced to almost nothing, frames bending instead of breaking, speed the best armor. Put them side by side and you can hear them arguing politely across time. Strength versus flexion, cargo versus agility. Then watch the hands move between them. A Norse farmer in Greenland uses an Inuit-style toggle on a line because it won't slip when wet and swollen. An Inuit hunter reshapes an iron nail found at a Norse site into a point too sharp for bone to match. Archaeologists find European metal in Thule layers on Ellesmere and Baffin. They find a ringed pin where no smithy should be. These are not trophies of conquest. They are the artifacts of exchange. Trade route sounds grand until you walk it. Often it's a string of faces, favors, and repeated gestures. Greenland's life depended on lines to Norway. A bishopric at Gerar, letters asking for iron and flour, tithes sent in ivory and rope. The king's mirror told princes what Greenland's waters look like when the sea freezes, how whales breathe, what men in skin boats do in surf. Someone wrote that because someone else said it at a table with bread and salt. Meanwhile, far to the east, Novgorod's birch-bark letters mention furs and debts to people whose names taste like cold. The maps lag behind like pack animals. When Olus Magnus finally draws the north in his great Carta Marina, long after our medieval story ends, it looks both like a monster garden and like something a fisherman would nod at and say, yes, that is more or less how they go. In winter a Greenland farm counts hay like breath. This many bales for cows, this many for sheep, this many for the goats that earn their keep on brush. Summer is a frenzy. Cutting, drying, stacking, praying the weather behaves. Come freeze, the sea becomes a road. Hunters walk among pressure ridges and listen for seal blowing beneath ice. The first crack is music and warning at once. Skis whisper. A fox passes like a rumor. Lamps burn blubber. The smell of seal and wool and smoke becomes the smell of safety. The church bell rings thin and brave in air that swallows sound. Faith here is not decoration. It is a schedule. Feast, fast, thaw, freeze, seed, slaughter. The liturgy keeps rhythm when weather wants to steal it. If you press your ear to the ground, you can hear the colony aging. Writs travel less often. Ivory falls out of fashion in rich rooms to the south. When a ship does arrive, it brings news 3 years stale and iron so precious a woman buries a broken knife with as much care as she buries a cup. One of the last documents out of Greenland is a marriage record. One of the last physical signs is a wardrobe's worth of clothing in her Jolfson's graves, cut in fashions that prove taste survives even as trade fades. A dress hem stitched neatly is an act of defiance against entropy. Step back from the fjord and up the spine of ice, and watch the climate's hand tighten by degrees. Storm tracks shift. Summers shorten by a whisper and then by a note. Hay yields drop. The Thule press east in their own migration, bringing harpoons and houses tailored to what's coming. A Norse farmer sees a new camp on the horizon. An Inuit hunter sees cattle in a valley that smells wrong. The sagas say there were fights. The middens say there were trades. Both can be true. The end is not one thing. Some farms empty when sons do not return over a horizon gone cold. Others thin gently until a door swings in wind, and then it doesn't because someone wedged it with a stone, and then even the wedge sinks into the turf and becomes a green wrinkle. Elsewhere, the north teaches other tricks. Under certain conditions, the sun will appear before it's physically above the horizon. A mirage called the Novaya Zemlya effect, light bent by layers of air into lying. A careless helmsman believes day has come. The careful one knows there are days that cheat. A parhelion sun-dog, burns beside the real sun in a halo of ice crystals. There are 3 lights in the sky now, and only one tells truth. A sailor makes peace with untruths he can predict. If you want to sail in a world like this, you must fall in love with verification. That's a modern word for a medieval habit. Look twice. And what of mathematics at sea? On land, scholars charted declination, predicted eclipses, and wrote tables that turned sky into schedule. At sea, a pilot's trigonometry fit inside his ribs. He knew the height of Polaris, though in 1000 it sat a few handwidths off true, and he knew the Little Dipper's tilt was a clock whenever clouds let him see it. He could measure a noon sun's height with a simple cross of wood held to his cheek long before the mariner's astrolabe was common. He could tell latitude by the way the midnight sun rolled in June. He did not need signs to stay alive. He needed repetitions that could survive fog and fear. In a monastery yard, a cartographer kneels over parchment and inks a coast narrower than it is because he has only a day's conversation for reference. He adds a cluster of islands because 3 captains insisted on them, and erases a sea monster because a younger monk laughed. Claudius Clavis sketches polar lands with surprising confidence in the 15th century. God knows whose weathered mouths he listened to. Even when they are wrong, these maps are love letters to places most of the mapmakers never saw. People who live there know better. They carry their maps in the body. Sore spots tell them where a pack rope always rubs. Calluses remember the shape of a tiller. The best charts are usually hands. Mid-roll moment and I'll make it quick. If you want more history that tastes like salt and lamp smoke, more voices from the edges becoming the main story, subscribe to Ash and Crown History. Keeps the lights on in rooms like this and sends us back into the archives and the weather. Back to the story. We've spoken of Leif and Gudrid, of Othere and Erik, of nameless Pomers and watchful Inuit. There's one more name to put with a question mark at the edge of the page. Eirikr, a bishop of Greenland, who a medieval Icelandic annal says went to Vinland around 1121 and did not return. A single line, almost casual, like dropping a pebble into a fjord and listening for an echo. Did he go? Did he die? Did he never leave? Scholars argue as they should. But even being able to argue tells us something. A century after Leif, people still spoke of that western shore as a place you could sail to, not just a story to tell. At Skraeling Island, in the high Arctic, a fragment of Norse metal surfaced under a modern spade. At Ruin Island, far north of where any Norse farm lay, Thule houses hold evidence of foreign goods. On Baffin Island, spun yarn, maybe Norse, maybe not, raises eyebrows. Each find is a whisper. Taken together, they sound like what you hear across a crowded hall when a song you know begins. That shiver of recognition that says, I've been here before, even if you cannot yet say exactly when. In the White Sea, a coke noses into a lead that wasn't there yesterday, and the crew falls silent to listen for the pitch of flow against hull. In Greenland, a priest raises a chalice and frost flowers bloom on the rim. In Iceland, a scribe whets a knife to sharpen a quill, copies a line, frowns, copies it again. In a Thule snow house, a grandmother tells a child what to do if the ice sings in a certain register under your feet. All of them are navigators. Not all of them hold a tiller. If there is a moral, let it be this: exploration is a kind of attention. The medieval Arctic rewarded those who looked long and punished those who demanded that the world behave like a map. Latitude could be measured with a shadow and a nerve. Contact could be trade one winter and conflict the next. Truth could be a butternut shell where no butternut grows, or a dress hem that lasted longer than a colony. Perhaps the most radical act in the North was to leave, to say, "This is not our place," and to carry the knowledge home anyway. We are not done. Ahead lies a last fire burning in a Greenland hall, the final letter that made it out before silence, and the years when snow reclaimed doorways and sheepfolds sank into their own walls. Before we go, take this with you. The North was never empty, never ignorant, never waiting to be discovered. It was a library some of us didn't know how to read. We're learning. Subscribe to Ash and Crown History so you don't miss the next chapter. We're going to stand in the ruins of Garros Cathedral and hear the bell in our throats. We're going to follow the Pomer east into water that eats ships and still somehow gives them back. And we'll ask, with a hand on cold stone, what finally turned Greenland's windows dark, and whether we're listening any better now than they could afford to then. East, where the Barents falls away into the White Sea and the wind smells of resin and salt, men built hulls that learned to listen to ice. They called themselves Pomers, sea people, and they launched their stout koches from river mouths braided with fog. The boats were round in the belly and strong at the ribs, planked in larch, tarred until they shone like wet stone. When the pack pressed, a coke did not explode. It climbed, squeezed up by pressure, and set down again like a seal finding air. In winter, when the sea sealed, the hulls waited on cribbing while men mended, traded, and told their sons how to hear ice move when the world pretended to be still. Long before any empire painted its seal across these waters, traders from Novgorod and beyond slipped along coasts the sagas had only guessed at. Othere of Hålogaland, who stood in King Alfred's hall a century before Iceland was fully settled, spoke of sailing so far north that the land bent east and then south again, of Jarmeland on the White Sea, of a river where men stacked furs like coin and words changed flavor in the mouth. Later, the Dvina flowed past log towns with names like Kolmogori. Birchbark letters in Novgorod's damp earth recorded debts in sable and fox and the names of men who owed them. The Murman coast, the Kola Peninsula, took its name from Nordman, the Norse. Languages braided because lives did. Sails crossed with sleds here. In spring, the Solovetsky Islands rose from the White Sea like boulders dropped by giants, and monks built a monastery whose bells could be heard in fog. They stacked cairns as sea marks across the labyrinth, taught fishermen to take bearings from towers and crosses, turned penance into navigation. In summer, Pomer crews shouldered salt and nets and rode into gulfs whose names sounded like warnings. In autumn, they ran for shelter when the wind shifted nastily to the north. Some years the Kara Gate, a narrow throat between Novaya Zemlya and Vigich, opened like an eye and let the ocean breathe through to the Ob and beyond. Other years it clenched, and men learned patience or paid with splintered planks. They hunted walrus on shingle beaches streaked with ice and blood, boiled fat into light, tanned hides into rope. They raised crosses on windswept islets, cached flour in stone-lined pits, and left notes knotted in birch bark for those who would overwinter in their wake. Nenets and Komi herders traded knowledge finer than gold, where a pass would be scoured bare by wind in January, which shore held a lee when the southwest blew for days, how to set a runner on snow that squeaks like dry sand because it is so cold the air itself cracks when you breathe. The Arctic did not care whether a man prayed east or west, cared whether he learned. Further west, there were islands nobody could agree on. An Icelandic annal from 1194 mentions Svalbard, the cold edge. It might have meant Spitsbergen. It might have meant a piece of East Greenland seen from a drifting floe. Names were anchors thrown into mist. Centuries later, Dutch whalers would name Jan Mayen and Barents would print Spitsbergen on a chart. In the medieval mouth, these places were rumors strong enough to guide a helm. Steer for the cold edge, a steersman might say, and the crew would nod because that was a true direction. In these waters, cartography lived first in bodies. A pilot knew that the Pechora Sea smells sour in certain winds. That driftwood of a certain grain means the Ob is telling you its flood peaked 3 weeks ago. That fog piles differently on a low coast than a high one. He carried a spare rudder lashed on deck, a habit learned from fathers who had watched one snap where the sea likes to ambush hulls from underneath. He packed a small pram inside the big boat, a baby hull for when an ice lead was too narrow, and a spare anchor because sometimes survival was just being heavy in the right place. All the while, far to the west across water like hammered iron, another community tested its own endurance against time. Greenland's farms inhaled summer and exhaled winter as if their lives were hinges in the year. When grass rose, women cut hay with short scythes and lifted it to drying frames while men stacked turfs for roofs and repaired sheepfolds. When sea ice set, hunters walked the edge where black meets white and listened for seal breathing under new ley. Lamps burned whale fat. The bishop's seat at Gerar tolled bells across a valley where the cry of geese in autumn could make a man feel rich. The colony sent ivory to Norway, received iron in return, and tried to keep God satisfied in a place where even July could murder a crop if it felt petty. The last bright domestic note we can place comes from a church on a hill at Valsøyfjord, where a wedding was recorded in 1408. Thorstein Olafsson took Sigurd Bjornsdottir to wife and neighbors signed their names the way weather lets you. Some carefully, some in a hurry. There's no further document from those farms. Next come letters from abroad written with a concern that thickens into pity. Ivar Brarson, a priest who traveled Greenland in the mid-14th century, wrote that the western settlement was empty, that people had left or been killed. He could not tell which. The truth is probably all of it. Ice, hunger, outmigration, violence where fear swelled, a trade artery narrowed by plague in Norway, and an economy too dependent on ivory when Europe stopped paying for tusks. Open a grave from those last generations and bone whispers. Isotopes and teeth say diets shifted toward the sea. More seal, more fish, as hay yields faltered and cattle thinned. Clothing from Herjolfsson's graves, preserved by chill and luck, proves taste endured at the edge. Green sleeves cut fashionably, hoods sculpted to warm the bones of a face and flatter it, stitching neat enough to make a tailor nod 6 centuries later. Humans adorn even as they retreat. If you want the North's last lesson from Greenland, it is this: dignity does not correlate with survival, but it insists on attending it. No one in those farms spoke of reaching the pole. Medieval sailors did not dream of conquering a coordinate. They dreamed of safe harbors, timber, iron, fat for lamps, a line of open water in the pack, and the relief of finding land at exactly the hour memory said it should rise. Routes mattered, returns mattered, relationships mattered. Heroics were accidental, something that happened on the way to hay, not an advertisement. On a calm day in a White Sea estuary, a boy watched his father tilt his head, and then he did the same. Hear that? the man asked. It sounded like an old door complaining. That's a floe turning under the wind. It means the lead is closing. We go now. A dozen actions followed. Coiling lines, shipping oars, a push with poles, a gentle kiss of hull against new skim ice, the quiet relief of water showing again dark as ink where it had been briefly milk. Knowledge here was a string pulled taut between sense and habit, plucked and vibrating in the body. Maps on parchment tried to keep up. Claudius Clavis, a Dane in the 15th century, sketched a north that looks almost modern in places, as if he had actually talked to men who went there instead of just reading other people's books. Arabic geography passed through Sicily and Provence into Latin. Alidrice's island ocean gave scholars in warm cities a cold thrill. The King's Mirror warned princes what it meant to sail where a sea can freeze. In Iceland, a monk copied a line that said a bishop sailed to Vinland in 1121. Whether he did or not, the line proves the destination lived in minds as a place and not only a legend. Everything people did here, Norse, Sami, Nenets, Komi, Inuit, Pomer, felt like an argument made to the weather. Sometimes the argument failed. A gale on the Merman coast could make a boat vanish 100 yards from safety. Summer fog could sit for a week and unteach you the difference between direction and motion. A deceptive sunrise, the Novaya Zemlya effect, where light bends and shows you a sun below the horizon, could trick a tired steersman. The people who learned to survive learned to suspect their eyes when the air layered its lies. Centuries later, Russia would send Vitus Bering to sketch the seam between continents and prove that Asia and America were two beings who only touched in cold and not in earth. His voyages belonged to a different age with different flags and instruments, but his ships sailed on knowledge long gathered in shallow bays and along low coasts, on Pomer routes, on Nenets words, on the old discipline of listening to ice. Jan Mayen and Spitsbergen would earn their names from Dutch whalers and German maps after our medieval stories end. The medieval word for them, if there was one, was probably simply, the place with whales when the wind is this way. We stand again in a Greenland church and invent the sound of the last mass on a winter morning. There is frost on the inside of the window. Breath hangs over heads like incense. The priest's voice is tired and faithful. Outside, a raven hops in the snow and looks surprised at nothing. When the door opens, wind turns the pages. When it closes, silence reasserts itself with authority. Sometime between that service and a thaw we cannot date, the light in that window went dark and did not come back. People left. People died. People married far away. The sheepfold tumbled into itself and grass covered the stones. The stories that survived became sagas, which are true in ways that facts are not and false in ways that bones refuse to be. Across the ocean, a woman kneels to birth a child in a timber hall, and a throat sings because singing shortens labor. In the White Sea, a monk sets a beacon stone and faces it as if it were an altar. On a fjord, a man rubs a knife with oil and hides it in a wall because iron is a future and walls are honest. In a snow house, a hunter tightens a line and teaches a child to feel with gloves on. These are the cartographers who drew the north so that later hands could trace it with ink. If this is the moment your stomach drops with the sense that we have been taught the wrong heroes, good. The medieval Arctic did not wait to be discovered. It negotiated, traded, it sang, it warned. It punished greed and rewarded humility and did not tolerate ignorance for long. The people who flourished were those who treated it as a teacher and not a trophy. You know who we are. This is Ash and Crown history. If these rooms of wind and ice feel like places where the main story has been hiding, subscribe. Keeps this ship afloat and sends us back out to where the maps go pale. We have one more stretch to sail. There is a light in a hall that won't survive another winter. A letter that crossed the sea and then failed to find an answer. And a final accounting that refuses to strike a clean line under why. We owe those who left and those who stayed a careful look at endings. As careful as the care we gave beginnings. Then we'll ask what the medieval North still has to teach a warm world that forgets it is made of weather. The last light in Garrus Hall burned low. Snow riffled past the shutter. The bell had a thin rime on its lip that winter and the clapper stuck for a breath before it rang. A woman lifted a dress to the lamplight and took pride in her seam even as worry pressed her mouth thin. They had counted hay twice. The hunters had listened at the ice edge and heard a new song in the floes, older, heavier. The priest wrote a letter that would ride a ship to Norway and then to no one, asking for iron and a chalice and a reminder from the center that those on the edge still belonged. It didn't end in one hard day. It was a long unbraiding. Trade lines slackened when plague thinned Norway. Ivory lost its buyers when elephant tusk flowed again into rich rooms. Summers shortened by a measure too small to see until you stacked the years together. Cattle faltered. People leaned harder on the sea. The diet shifted and bones learned new elements. There were fights, likely. There were trades, certainly. There were decisions made in kitchens that had nothing to do with conquest and everything to do with a niece's chance if they left and a son's chance if they stayed. On a September day in 1408, in the church at Valsey, neighbors wrote their names to witness a marriage under a slate sky so clean it hurt. A year later, someone's lamb bawled for milk and got less than it wanted. A decade later, a door that always stuck swung easily because the frame had shrunk in a colder year. Then there were floors with grass pushing through cracks and ravens claiming timbers. There is no neat line to draw under a society. There is only a widening silence you notice when you've been inside a house enough years to know its sounds. Far away, the rest of the North kept talking. In Bergen's Brigand Wharf, Hansa traders stacked stockfish in towers that smelled like wakefulness and money. Somewhere inside a chest on Lewis, someone tucked a handful of carved men and bishops made from walrus, their faces round and anxious, their teeth showing like they were cold. Ivory likely cut from Greenland tusks, a game played in Britain with a piece of the Arctic as king. In Novgorod, a boy scratched a love note onto birch bark and jammed it behind a beam where time would keep it safe. In an Irish farm, a priest described a far northern island where days behave strangely. In Norman Sicily, a geographer inked islands on silver because merchants swore they had seen them. The lines between these places were thin and strong as a seal's sinew rope. Greenland's ivory didn't move without Norwegian ships. Norwegian ships didn't move without Hansa credit. Down in courts, ivory wore crowns as scepters carved from unicorn horns, and kings bought a sort of miracle that had started in a Greenlander's wet, cold hands. A Pomer pilot on the White Sea watched for weather that would let him try the Kara Gate again, following Nenet's advice sharpened by winters harder than any court ever knew. A Sami herder led reindeer by sound across a ridge no map could represent as well as the story his grandmother had used to teach him how snow talks when it is about to give way. There's a temptation to make the Arctic into a stage where a single hero proves something to us. That's not what it was. It was a library of methods. A Norse shadowboard tucked into a steersman's chest to check the noon sun's angle in summer. A split tally in a coastal steading, each half a promise until they reunited in spring. A toggle made from bone that saved a fish when hands were numb and a line tried to lie. A cocked hull shaped to live with pressure. An Inuit parka cut to breathe when you don't have the luxury of sweat. A prayer sung to keep a rhythm while hay was cut, because rhythm keeps you faster and faster means you can bring more in before the weather turns. And yet, we are drawn to a single voice at the end. So take Othere of Hålogaland, who stood in a Wessex hall around 890 and told Alfred's scribes why he sailed north. Not for taxes, not for plunder, but because he wanted to find out how far the land extended to the north. He followed a jagged shore until it turned east and then south, traded in the White Sea, named peoples the King's Hall had never heard named before. His words crossed languages and centuries to reach us. Their plainness is their dignity. He wanted to know. He went to see. He told what he saw. Another sort of explorer held her son to breast by a Newfoundland hearth and named him Snorri. And the fact of his breath pulled Vinland out of saga and into muscle. A Pomer in a coke nosed toward Ugorski Shar and then did not, because the flows spoke the wrong grammar that day, and the wisdom of turning back carried a crew into spring. All of them shared one refusal, to let ignorance be comfortable. They were not brandishing flags in empty rooms. They were entering rooms where people already lived and asking, clumsily, sometimes violently, sometimes beautifully, how to share the air. We dig now where their feet fell. At Lonseux Meadows, a lump of iron bloom tells us someone smelted bog or hammered rivets into shape on a shore the sagas stubbornly kept remembering. A butternut shell where no butternut tree grows says that someone went farther south than that northern cape. On Baffin, spun yarn raises questions that would have made sense at a Greenland hearth. In her Jolfsons, a cuff holds a stitch neat as anything in a modern atelier. In Gerer, a bishop's seat faces emptiness and keeps being a seat anyway. Every shovel full of peat that yields pollen stories is another line in a diary we didn't know we could read. We also watch the north change again. Ice withdraws. Water opens where our ancestors only walked. New routes appear along the Siberian coast that men died trying to find with dead reckoning and bad charts. Nations hurriedly friendly and less friendly measure the distance between ports and resources and call it opportunity. The Arctic is once more a mirror held up to the rest of us. Do we treat it as a teacher or as a trophy? The medieval answer was mixed. The only correct lesson to carry forward is the one that favors humility over hunger. The last story we promised, the one to carry in your pocket after the credits, is neither a king's nor a bishop's. It is a small tale with the dignity of plainness. A woman in the eastern settlement stitched a hood in the Herjolfsson style while a child slept and seal fat hissed faintly in a lamp. She set the seam under an arm so it would not chafe when lifting hay and cut the face opening so snow would not bully its way in. She showed it to her neighbor, who repeated the cut in her own cloth because she could see the intelligence in it. That pattern lasted 6 centuries underground. When it came out, it looked like something a person would make today because good answers look like themselves no matter when they are born. If you need a single proof that the medieval North is not quaint but competent, put that hood on your head and step into wind. What do we take from them, then? That discovery is attention married to courage. That routes matter more than trophies. That leaving can be as wise as staying. That neighbors save more lives than heroes. That trade moves stories as efficiently as it moves tusk and fish. That a line copied by a bored monk about a bishop who maybe sailed west is as thrilling as a golden idol if what you care about is the breadth of a human map. You have stood in fog with us and learned to listen for surf you cannot see. You have watched a coke climb ice instead of break. You have stood in a Greenland church where the last wedding was written down and then the ink froze. You have held an iron rivet still smelling a little like bog in your mind. If this changed anything in you, if it widened your horizon by the width of one new name, then help us widen it for someone else. Subscribe to Ash and Crown History. It's one click that buys a little more time in archives and a few more miles under a stubborn sky. Before you go, tell us this in the comments. Whose north do you want next? The Sammy's reindeer roads? The Pomers' wintering harbors? The Thule's constellation lessons? Or we can keep following Gudrid to Rome and back and ask what a life looks like when its horizon refuses to shrink. We answer curiosity here with work. Bring yours. Somewhere, the sea lifts in the dark and sets itself down again, and a pilot tilts his head and hears the difference. Somewhere, the last candle in a turf house goes out and a raven claims the ridgepole in the morning. Somewhere, an archaeologist kneels in cold sun and brushes a thread that carried warmth across 600 winters. The map isn't finished. It never will be. That is not a failure. That is our invitation.